So I'm going to just talk for a few minutes before switching over to, the formal PowerPoint presentation. I want to thank Sarah and Liz a lot for setting this up, for Abby for the invitation to share this project that was really one of the first projects that I made about Boston, specifically since moving here 5 years ago. I also am really excited to be here in dialogue with the Environmental Studies program. Last spring, I had the great good fortune to be a fellow at the Rachel Carson Institute for Environment and Society in Munich, Germany, and where I was, one of the only artists present, but I found the connections between environmental humanists and people who are working in a policy arena. We had a regular Tuesday speaker series for people who were scientists, scientists working in policy, government officials, to come together and to talk about the possibilities of collaborating across the art, humanities, academic, and policy divides. So a lot of really thought-provoking dialogues came out of that. So I'm happy to be back in this space. I'm also really grateful that the program has taken to heart the experiences of Tuesday, which I found, really inspiring and challenging, and model some of make public some of the reflection that I've been doing a lot about my own practice over the years. I'm going to be sharing a little bit of work in very broad outlines before going in greater depth with a project that's on view right now at Tufts. In addition to the statement that Sarah read, I want to acknowledge that I am a settler on this continent. I was born in what is known as California, on lands that have been traditionally homelands of the Chumash, Tongva, and Fernandino-Tatavian peoples. I was raised drinking the waters of the Colorado River and the Feather River, and I now live here on the lands of the Massachusetts people, and I drink from the waters of the Swift River that were dammed 75 years ago by the Quabbin Reservoir, which is on Nipmuc territory. So every day I'm really humbled in my efforts to be in better relation to these lands and these waters and these peoples. And that process includes, trying to live my life in certain ways, and sometimes it includes making art and participating in these kinds of public seminars. So that statement is coming out of a conversation that happened a few years ago with Ojibwe language scholar Margaret Newton. We had a group of artists and writers had invited her to come and participate in a self-organized seminar that I had been organizing in the Upper Midwest, where I also do some work, one summer. And she wrote back saying she wasn't able to participate, but what she wanted to contribute was a challenge to us to learn to name not just the indigenous inhabitants of a place, but the bodies of land and water that sustain us, and that we must be accountable and responsive, have responsibilities too. I think that this relates, in her case, to traditional Ojibwe and practices of identifying the place you are from and of, as well as whose land you are on when you are a guest in another person's territory. I also think her challenge asks us to remember that we are not outside of the ecological and colonial relationships that are identified by a land acknowledgement, which often place those relationships as being in the past. Rather, we are entangled in them, we are perpetuating them through our very existence, and we therefore are, whether we choose to accept it or deny it, already have responsibilities because of those entanglements. So I'm going to switch over to my slideshow right now. There we go. So the title of my presentation this afternoon is Being Entangled, all right, which I think is an evocative but sometimes oblique term. I use it for a couple of reasons. One is that I think it helps to capture how there is no outside position from which to address something called the environment, right? I think the second is that the word entanglement is a very kind of succinct way of sort of positioning what I do in light of some, relatively recent post-humanist discussions about assemblages, larger than human material, human cultural entanglements. But I also think that it acknowledges the condition of unavoidable complicity in the damage of the world that most of us with the privilege to be here in this Zoom presentation on a beautiful fall afternoon enjoy, and which we can't help but perpetuate by the virtue of being here. So my overall goal this afternoon is to convince you that artistic approaches are well suited to understand, interpret, and ultimately affect small but meaningful shifts in the way these eco-political entanglements are experienced and used. As I said before, I'm going to speak very, very briefly to a few earlier projects that might provide some context for my method and ongoing interests before delving into the project at Tufts a little bit more in depth. I was talking with Sarah a little bit before the talk, and I brought up the work of philosopher Alexis Shotwell, who talks a lot about the problems of living ethically in what she calls compromised times. She uses words like entanglement to describe how political action is inevitably bound up with the very forces it opposes. This situation, she writes, is complicated, compromised, and impossible to conceptualize. She asks us to make continually contingent and unsettled decisions about how to be in relation to the world, with no predetermined answer. In her book, she turns to artistic approaches several times, and she uses this kind of diverse and methods of artistic inquiry as one of the few spaces in contemporary culture, but especially academia, where the contingent, unsettled, and non-deterministic is actually embraced and cultivated as part of our jobs, embraced in our practices, and embodied in our pedagogy. I often say that as an artist, I'm drawn to weird places that turn out to be not so weird after all. I tend to work with sites that are layered and complex, and where there are many seemingly contradictory forces, histories, and activities that exist in the same place. I think in a country and a cultural tradition where landscapes tend to be divided into wilderness, protected places of scenic beauty, and essentially everything else is more or less a sacrifice zone, I'm interested in places that trouble these distinctions, where those uses are contradictory and where the stories and histories have plot lines that don't seem to intersect until all of a sudden we see the connections. I should also say that I tend to work in places where I have some kind of family connection, either places I live, have lived, or have family relationships. Some of this is tactical. I can visit family and work on the project at the same time, but it's also because these projects often take a really long time to unfold, and without something rooting me in a place, I don't feel like I can possibly do justice to it. And even then, it's a complicated and I think ethically fraught territory sometimes. So some of my previous work has asked a set of questions such as follows. So in this film around Crab Orchard, I was asking how a wildlife refuge in the middle of a belt of anti-Black sundown towns came to host a multinational defense contractor that manufactures depleted uranium ammunition, and how a lake in that very same wildlife refuge, polluted from earlier military and industrial uses, would come to be used as the sole source of drinking water for the first federal supermaximum security prison. In the more recent essay film Grassland, I was asking how the US Forest Service could justify the expansion of fracking on a federally managed grassland that is also located on traditional Cheyenne and Arapaho territory by cynically pointing out that it actually isn't so scenic because it had already been an industrial sacrifice zone by ranching and by the presence of nuclear missiles. These nuclear missiles are guarded over by a military force who's appropriated the figure from an Alfred Bierstadt painting, The Last Buffalo Hunt, as their symbol. And more recently, I just completed a very short 4-minute essay piece that asks how the living cultural memories of the last great climate change might allow us to understand how arbitrary, seemingly fixed, but really temporary institutions like property might be re-inhabited and reimagined. Right. So that's just a little bit of context. These places are all kind of unified in so far as they're the result of overlapping, knotted, conflicting operations of material practices, ideologies, imaginaries, and the agency of both biotic and abiotic forces, to such a degree that they can't really be thought or experienced separately at all. They're entangled. The relationship between a contaminated lake, depleted uranium, and a prison might not be causal, but it is connected. The lines connecting, say, the Sand Creek Massacre, thermonuclear warheads, and the natural gas boom on the Colorado Plateau do not run straight, but they are knotted. I'm really influenced by art historians T.J. Demos and Emily Scott, who have celebrated art and activist projects that attend to these kinds of politically entangled relations. And they call this ecologies of intersectionality. The concept of intersectionality was, of course, originally developed by Kimberly Crenshaw to describe how multiple forms of oppression are experienced together. And it has sort of evolved into a method for examining the interlocking and mutually constitutive operations of race, class, gender, and heterosexism and maintaining social hierarchies. But perhaps it also will help us to understand that ecology is a space where that intersectionality occurs as well. That ecology is another dimension of human intersectionality, and that human intersectionality also produces ecologies. I don't think that this observation displaces the social, nor does it displace the ecological. Rather, it grounds and compounds it. I think that the intersectionality of ecology is not just sort of a nice humanistic or artistic metaphor, but it is also scientific. Data about the Orbis spike, the global drop in atmospheric carbon dioxide that began the Little Ice Age around 1610. This was the first moment where humanity, right, that term needs to be very much unpacked in that sentence, made a global environmental impact as measurable and can be seen in ice core samples. We understand that this is not the result of just natural forces. This is the result of colonization, the deaths of hundreds of millions of people in what is now North and South America. I think dominant discourses on climate change can both move from recognizing this reality to naturalizing or disavowing it quite simply when we start talking about short techno fixes for carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere. So I want to sit with the discomfort and the knowledge that colonial processes initiated long-term environmental change. And I do so at times by listening to Indigenous philosophers, people like Kyle Powys Whites, who made a provocation a number of years ago to settler-descended so-called allies or accomplices to work through their or my ancestral investments in climate genocide. I want my work to contribute to a larger project whereby white settler-descended people like myself, including myself, starting with myself, let go of those attachments that are harming the planet and instead seek to develop relationships of responsibility, accountability, and intimacy instead. So that is where Ecologies of Acknowledgement kind of came from or began. I want to just quickly say that this project initiated out of an invitation from the University of Massachusetts at Boston to produce a new work in relation to the territories of Boston and Boston Harbor in conjunction with an exhibition called Local Ecologies that was put on by 3 different UMass campuses, each campus commissioning 1 or 2 works for the show. And so it traveled around the state of Massachusetts, mostly Eastern Massachusetts, over the last year. And now this iteration at Tufts is the most recent one. So this was made by collaboratively editing an interview and our conversation with 3 Indigenous women from the Massachusetts and Nipmuc tribes, both of those tribes, neither of which have federal recognition. And I'm actually going to show the entirety of the video. It's about 10 minutes long. So let's begin.
oftentimes when introducing ourselves and explaining ourselves, some of our people share our creation stories, which interestingly enough usually mirror geological processes and formation of the landscape that we're named of, that we belong to.
Our creation stories do the exact opposite with how Western society kind of separates us from the landscape. Even though Westerners named us after the landscape, they also removed us from that very landscape. So when we're thinking about ecologies, we can't only focus on plants or the environment.
If you go back 10,000 years, the harbor islands were not islands. The entire, what is now the Boston Harbor, was dry land. We lived there, and then when the sea came in, we moved inland.
Our creation stories help us understand who we are, how we came to be in this place, and what our responsibility and role is among all of the other inhabitants, beings, and species of that space.
We've been here for thousands of years. We're still here, and we will remain here.
There's a reason why many Indigenous peoples will start with those stories. And there's a reason why folks that support power, domination, and control will try to discredit those stories and that knowledge.
There's beauty in the work that we are able to do when we are with the land. I believe it holds memory, and it may not be the same language that we're using right now or that we're used to, but things come to us the more that we're in relation to the system that we're supposed to be in relation to.
In many of the histories and timelines that you might find around the islands, they usually start with colonization and leave just a little bit of information to the fact that there were Native people living there, but they leave out the trading that was occurring. That many of our stories talk about how we've migrated and traded and communicated with folks from the global south for thousands of years before the United States was even formed. Nipmuc means freshwater people. We are named after the landscape. The land is part of us. The water is part of us.
So during the war, there became a point where the English were just like so afraid of any Native person. So they divided it so people in praying towns were considered friend Indians.
My ancestors moved into praying towns because they felt that that was what would protect themselves and their children, and to a certain extent, some of their land. I don't think that was ever really the deal in the minds of the colonists.
You couldn't even go hunting unless you had like a certain like pass or something, but like if you weren't seen or had like that identification, you could be shot on site without any questions being asked.
We still see the consequences of the captivity of our women and families, of our brown and black men, the forced removal, the displacement, the privatization of land as being directly related to the trauma, the poverty, the violence that we still experience as Indigenous peoples today.
We're still doing the same thing over and over again. And so you have folks coming from Central America, and they're coming from Central America because of our interventions in Central America.
All I can think of is just a frantic time of worrying about your children and the future of your children and trying to figure out a way to stay safe. And that is not lost on me today, in this very moment, that there are hundreds and thousands of people that are experiencing the exact same fear. What does decolonization mean when we are still justifying concentration camps and the detention of families in very harsh living conditions? We still struggle to see these folks as Indigenous peoples.
A true land acknowledgement is working with the people of that land and asking them what that means for them, for that place. Really, the value system of how we're operating and how we're living, it's so embedded in all of us that it's really hard to imagine a world outside of it.
Nothing is ever static from an Indigenous perspective. Things are always moving and changing and evolving and adapting. So land acknowledgement really is a process. It should not end with just we here whose land we're on, but think deeply about what that means. That means that all of us on this land are benefiting from the displacement, removal, the murder of people who came here before, understanding that we aren't the ones that necessarily created that disaster. Yet we are here in this lifetime with a responsibility to do something about it.
And now we're talking about, again, the movement of the sea. We realized you can't stop the sea. But what is really happening now is there's a lot of talk about exactly how we can do that. Rather than saying, okay, this is happening, how do we work in harmony with it? But still constantly trying to push back, push back, push back. Like, no, we're in control.
Folks that believe in that way of life, of extracting, of domination, of power, of control, that could be anyone from the administration of the United States to a corporation to the very managers of the islands.
The dominant culture commodifies everything. And so land is commodified, people are commodified, resources are commodified. And one of the things is really to kind of move away from this idea of commodification and more into the idea of us being part of a larger whole, because we are. We live in a closed environment. We live on this planet and we are part of it and not the masters of it.
Sarah, you're muted.
There, sorry about that. I lost control of my mouse. With that in full screen mode. All right, thanks for your patience, everyone. I wanted to spend just a minute or two to talk a little bit about some of the other pieces of this project and how I understand some of the formal choices in the video working together. So obviously, this piece is a lot about thinking about ecologies of past, present, and future, exploring the very difficult and dark history of Deer Island as a place of really a concentration camp during the war that settlers call King Philip's War, which can also be called the Metacom Rebellion. I think in doing a lot of the shooting in this piece, I was really interested in the difference between a static view as embodied by traditions of landscape painting and this much more dynamic handheld camera work, which was really about being embedded in a landscape and selectively, choosing to focus on one thing after another, but holding the focus being an act of control and struggle, and then being able to move to another place and having what was previously in focus fall out of focus. The other really important piece as a formal aspect of the film for me was the role of audio. I'm really interested in the ways that sense hierarchies imply or reflect ways of sort of epistemological primacy. So living in a very visually oriented society, the eyes are directional. There is a foreground, a middle ground, a background. It is very difficult to keep everything in focus at once, especially if we're looking at the things that are closest to us. All of these are very resonant metaphors for the limitations of certain epistemes. Sound is a sense that operates completely differently. It is an omnidirectional sense. We are immersed in a soundscape. We can't shut off our ears the way that we can shut our eyes. And so, although subtle, the soundscape in the film is a really important way of capturing additional information about the place and placing us in it, and placing us. I also have a still up right now that is part of the kind of audiovisual collage that is taken up more in the third chapter of the video, where I start to use texts and images and little kind of collage animations to start to expose or talk about some of the aspects of the landscape that the landscape as a picture actually conceals. It shows us the current moment of that place, but it doesn't show us all of the forces, the laws, the histories that went into the production of that place. And I allow some of that to surface in the animation. As was said at the outset by Liz, this originally included the presentation of the letterpress print that you see produced during the space of the film. I actually don't have a photograph of it from the Tufts iteration, but as the print has been re-exhibited, at every stop, it acquires markings, erasures, and additions from every venue, as every venue tries to add to their own process of understanding of what a land acknowledgement that is meaningful might require. So that's an installation shot from the initial piece. I want to also touch on some programming that for me isn't outside of the project, it's actually part of the project. So on Tuesday, we had a panel discussion with 4 people, Ferris Gray, who you see on screen right now with a microphone, Elizabeth Solomon, Neil Hawley, and Kristen Wyman. But and that I understand as being part of the project. The initial iteration was actually a boat tour called Indigenous Boston Harbor Islands, and it was a tour led by 3 of the 4 of them, taking a group of about 120 people from the UMass Boston campus through the harbor, past some of the kind of lesser known islands, and out to Deer Island, where we walked to the site that was dedicated for a yet unbuilt monument to the internment on Deer Island. These are not outside of the creation of the artifacts, because they're invitations to everyone who comes to those events to themselves enter into a space of learning and relationship with the Indigenous people of this place. So they're an extension of some of the goals by another means. Just in conclusion, before opening it up to discussion, here I'll stop my share. Before opening up to discussion, I just want to underscore what some of the speakers in the film make very clear, right? That the ecological crisis is not just a crisis of carbon dioxide levels, mass extinctions, or sea level rise, though those are urgent and alarming. It is also a crisis of values, knowledge, and representation. So to reshape those underlying cultural beliefs that contribute to the crisis, I think artistic interventions are necessary, and as necessary as the work of climate scientists and resiliency engineers. I think if climate change is truly the epochal change and involves geologic proportions, it really requires that everything be reevaluated. Economies, values, cultures, ideas of the autonomous individual, notions of freedom, value systems structured around human needs. I think that that's some of the work that artists are equipped to contribute to this process. And I look forward to talking with all of you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was great. We'll give people a couple of minutes to either put questions in the Q&A section or to raise their hands to ask their questions out loud. And in the meantime, I would like to ask you, what inspired you to work on this project? And also, well, you can answer that first and I'll ask my follow-up question.
Sure. So this was a collaboration with my partner, Nicholas Brown, who works, he also has an MFA degree and has a background as an artist, but he also has a PhD, and he works at this sort of in the space of cultural landscape studies. So his doctoral degree is in the history and theory of landscape architecture, but he works a lot with indigenous landscapes and in indigenous studies, settlers colonial studies. When we first moved to Boston in 2015, he already knew about Deer Island and some of the work that Kristen Wyman has been doing with an annual commemorative paddle commemorating the internment of the Nipmuc people during the war. And because he had been engaged with like a whole variety of indigenous media forms up until that point. So he had listened to a hour-long interview with her. We began going to that place because it was interesting to us, and then over time, through participation in different public events, with learning more about indigenous histories and presence in the greater Boston area, when we received this invitation, already had some relationship with first Elizabeth Solomon, and then through her, we met some of the other people who have been involved in the project over time. So it was our first, we finally felt ready to do a project about Boston 4 years after moving to the city, because it takes time to learn about a place and to build relationships organically, and to attempt to be non-extractive, which I think, as we were discussing on Tuesday, is extraordinarily difficult, right, when career success and institutions are involved. And I certainly don't pretend to have achieved that here, but I do want to acknowledge the collaborators who made the work possible.
Nice. And along those lines, when you were putting this project together, did you have an audience in mind that you wanted to target? And if so, or even if not, what were you hoping that people interacting with this project get out of it? Well,
so because this was a piece that was invited, rather than one that I initiated myself, we had the built-in audience of a lot of students at UMass Boston. And so we were able to talk a lot with the curator there and work with some faculty there to build in some opportunities for students to come and see the piece. Although I make work that is broadly nonfiction, right? And has certain documentary characteristics. as a result. I don't think of it as a documentary that tells you, a straightforward or definitive history of whatever place or subject that it's about. The work is much more essayistic. It's much more about trying to identify places of resonance and connection between disparate ideas and how they are materialized in places. So I don't see it as the first or only story that needs to be told about this place, about Boston Harbor, Deer Island, but rather a piece in a constellation of media interpretations, artistic strategies that have already been made and that are yet to be made.
Thank you. So now I'm going to read a couple of questions from the Q&A. We have a question here asking, what does reimagining the idea of the autonomous individual look like in practice?
Well, that's not a small question. So I think that I have been thinking a lot about, coming from the arts. A lot of our traditions honed over, now 100 and some odd years of modernism really celebrate the free individual making a mark and rebelling from the norms and the constraints of society that produce them. For coming out of arts and a world that has kind of validated and celebrated that, I think for me, that asks me to interrogate why I am uncomfortable sometimes with the idea of making work that is instrumental, that's in the service of some kind of collective political project, or that might be goal-oriented in some way, rather than work that reflects my individuality, interiority, or my own unique take on the world or an issue. I think that question of what it means to reevaluate that idea of individuality is one that people can only ask from within the work that they do, and to think about how value accumulates to individuals rather than collective entities, and why I think in many of our academic fields tend to encourage us to pursue highly individualized research paradigms. I think this is somewhat less true, in the sciences, but within academia, the notion that you are, ultimately reviewed for your own personal contributions to a field, right, is an example of a very concrete place where those of us who have, tenured privilege, I think can do some work to reevaluate what that might look like going forward or in the future.
Another question from the Q&A, what advice would you have for artists who are starting to add ecological messaging to their work, but aren't sure where to take it? What advice do you have for them?
I think that where you take it is maybe less important than where you begin. And I think the beautiful reality is that every place we are is always already ecological. And I think there's a great essay, really old essay at this point, by William Cronin called The Trouble with Wilderness, Getting Back to the Wrong Nature. And in that essay, he starts to examine the movement of ants on a tree outside his window, and talks about, why is that or is that not, part of the nature that we might get back to, or why is getting back to that not something that we what are some of the implications of that impulse to get back to something? And I think that essay was influential for me in realizing that I don't need to worry necessarily about the end, but really about the beginning and the means. And the end starts to be built by the act of pursuing the means. So that would be my advice to artists. I don't think it's the same as being unambitious, but to make sure that you're not leaping over all of the steps of process in order to get somewhere too fast.
Thank you. And speaking of influence, there's another question. You earlier mentioned a philosopher, Alexis, and if you could repeat the
Yeah.
full name and also how this person informed your work.
Sure. Her name is Alexis Shotwell, and the book is called Against Purity. And I think that as an artist, there are certainly people and theoretical influences, interlocutors who have been influential. There's also places where I read things and I find resonance, and I'm able to understand things that I've already been doing in a different way, and I develop new vocabulary for understanding something that was already in process. So reading that book, Against Purity, was very much a process of recognition. So she talks in that book about a variety of, largely but not exclusively, what we might call like cultural practices, performance. She writes about groups that do biological monitoring, and she writes about them as people who are like actively negotiating the real kind of an entanglement of contamination and pristine in nature as an active accountability and to contribute to scientific research. She also writes about the Truth and Reconciliation process in Canada, which is where she is from and based. And I think what was really influential and helpful about her work for me is a quote actually toward the very end of the book, which I go back to, where she talks about how people who are involved in movements for social change make a lot of mistakes and get a lot of things wrong. But she says that it isn't such a problem if we understand that the purpose of the work isn't to be right, but the purpose is to change the world. And what I find inspiring and helpful about that is it helps to move or sort of jolt you out of this fear of taking the first step, and reminds you to be open and humble and to recognize that there is no perfect way, right? There are only incremental steps, and that making mistakes is an impossibility and is actually the only thing that we can do to be able to move forward.
Yes, so such beautiful words. There's another question. So ecologists tend to think of the world as in constant flux and rather than in balance. Mm-hmm. So actually Colin is wondering, does the concept of changing ecologies enter your work, and if so, how?
Yes, I think very much. I mean, I'm really interested in ecologies that include people and which are immediately, ones that are constantly changing. So I'm trying to think about a really, I think in the video that I just completed, which is a very short piece about the land that my partner's family has in Wisconsin. That land is traditionally Ho-Chunk territory. The Ho-Chunk remain an active presence in the area, and have in their oral histories stories of the last ice age. So to be able to look out and to have living cultural memories of a place where the glacier ended. That is a tremendous and remarkable cultural resource, to know that surviving massive ecological change is difficult, but also possible. And I take a great deal of I'm humbled by, and I take a great deal of inspiration from a very long-term, deep time cultural memory, which is pretty much the antithesis of what we have sort of in the capitalist modernity, which is an exceptionally short-term outlook.
Thank you. Are there any further questions for our speaker today? Or Sarah, do you have any final thoughts you would like to add? Oh, there's another question.
Sure, that sounds.
What you think of your final thoughts? Are there any books that you can recommend to learn about oral histories in ecology?
Oral histories and ecology. I'm embarrassed to say no. I think other people probably in the environmental studies program would be better equipped to do that for me. Another person I really admire and who I've had the privilege to work with is an artist named Claire Pentecost. And she has this lovely little essay called The Public Amateur. And she sort of describes the role of the artist as being one of the amateur. The amateur not being a derogatory term, but the root word is love, amar. So the artist is the person who feels a passion for something and passionately pursues it, not from a position of expertise, but from a position of wanting to know more. And I feel very much like I'm in that case all the time. I'm constantly exploring new media for my work. I'm trying to deepen my engagement with a whole variety of interdisciplinary subjects, but generally from a position of indiscipline rather than discipline. So when people ask me for bibliographic citations, it's sometimes really hard for me to generate them on the spot.
And I think it's so great that artists and scientists collaborate, and I've seen so many more collaborations coming up the last few years. I think such a powerful intersection to transmit messages. We have a few more questions. Let me see. So you talk about the impacts of sound and auditory senses in your video. Do you have any thoughts on the role of ephemerality and time in physical works?
By physical works, does the questioner mean like installations, or I'm curious, like architect, is it in an art space or is it another kind of space?
Michaela, I'm going to allow you to talk so you can explain, sculptural.
In sculptural, yeah. I mean, sound is a really remarkable sense and very malleable medium that I think allows us to enter into an apprehension of time that's very different. When I generally have in my classes at least a week where we do a variety of listening exercises. This is in my media art classes, that encourage students to sit for an uncomfortably long time, at least for people who have been raised in a very instantaneous, flashy media environment, and simply listen to what is happening. There are a variety of meditation practices that tap into sound. It tends to slow the experience of time down to really listen very intently to sound, and I think moves us away from a space that visual media often reinforce, which is looking for eventfulness. And I think for that reason, sound is an interesting addition to architectural environments or installation spaces, because it invites a going deeper into what is immersive about the physical environment rather than what's purely visual about it. I think that may have answered the question, but feel free to type more if there's more clarification. That's just my thoughts.
Great. Any final questions from the audience? You can also raise your hand and we'll unmute you if you prefer to do so. If not, Sarah, if you wanted to add something else before we conclude this section. Yeah. Sorry, one more question. So can you tell us more about sacrifice zones?
Yeah, so the notion of sacrifice zones is, I think, one that has surfaced in a variety of places, but specifically around legacies of the nuclear. So and which are obviously really connected to environmental justice. That for the purpose of having a particular national or capitalist goal in mind, that might be deemed necessary, or in the case of the nuclear throughout the 20th century, for national security, international relations, entire aspects of the country and entire portions of the world were essentially deemed sacrificable. And they were rendered sacrificable because the people who lived there were impoverished and very often brown, and within, or indigenous, right, in the United States and also in the Pacific Islands. I think the idea of sacrifice zones, though it sort of originated from the experience of the nuclear with mining, testing, et cetera, I think we can expand it to many other kinds of territories where fracking produces sacrifice zones, extreme forms of strip mining produce sacrifice zones. And increasingly, the unwillingness of the United States to deplete, to cut its own carbon dioxide emissions is rapidly making the entire Earth a sacrifice zone to a particular vision of capitalist modernity that's fueled by fossil fuels and believes in perpetual growth.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. And now I'm really closing.
Okay.
I'm going to turn the mic to you to give your final thoughts.
Sure. I think that my final thoughts, just for people who are here in the Boston area, is to remember that we are in a landscape whose traditional, whose life, whose history goes back considerably farther than 400 years. We're here in the moment of the Plymouth 400 celebration, and every place here has been here for much longer. It has not looked the way that it looks now. It will not look this way forever. And to connect that past, present, and future as much as you can in your consciousness of space, and to take up that challenge to know whose land you are on and how to be in right relation to the people of those land who still exist, who are still here, and who have very valuable lessons to impart to us today.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for coming this week, and we hope to see you next week.